Welcome back to Technically Edinburgh, the podcast for and about technicians at the University of Edinburgh. Thank you for joining us for our feature episode on professional registration for technicians. We've been excited about bringing you this episode for months, and I'm so pleased it's finally all come together. Before we get started, I would like to note that our guest is a professional registration mentor and assessor for the Science Council, so this episode does focus heavily on professional registration opportunities from the Science Council. Other bodies and awards are available to suit your experience and career, like EngTech and RCAM. More information on these and others can be found on our website and our SharePoint, which we will have links to in our show notes. So it's time to get on with the show and find out more about professional registration and why we think you should consider it.
Hello and welcome to Technically Edinburgh, the podcast for and about technicians at the University of Edinburgh. My name is Lee Murphy.
And I'm Charlie Corcoran. Today we're joined by Laurence Dawkins-Hall. Laurence is a life sciences technician currently working at the University of Leicester as a core support technician. Laurence has an international CV and about 35 years of experience in different fields, including virology, parasitology, cardiovascular research, and cancer research. His career has involved bench-based science involving the use of molecular and biology techniques, protein biochemistry, and drug discovery. Laurence has also been intimately involved in teaching and training others during his different roles, and for the last 8 years has been pursuing work outside lab pertaining to the technician commitment. Recently, earlier this year, Laurence won the Outstanding Lifetime Achievement Award from Lab Innovations. And he's also an applicant support mentor for the Science Council. He supports technicians who are applying for professional registration, and he's joining us today to discuss professional registration, who it's for, and why you should consider it. Welcome to the podcast, Laurence.
Thank you very much. Pleased to be here, and thank you for having me.
We're very excited to find out more about your work with professional registration and why we should all be looking into it. But can you start by telling us a bit about your career journey? What was your motivation to work in science?
Yes, so my motivation to work in science was I was very sort of science orientated at school. My passions were science, history and maths. And I decided really the first sort of flicker that I may go into science as a professional career was I started reading popular science books and also naturalist books such as Life on Earth by David Attenborough, a couple of textbooks including The Double Helix by Jim Watson. And I read those actually quite early on as a teenager. And that really sort of aligned me to the idea that having done a science degree at university, that I would actually go on and become a professional scientist.
And that was Lee was just holding up his copy of The Double Helix there. I don't know if you saw that a lot. So what motivated you then to move from bench science into the mentoring that you've been doing more recently?
Yeah, so I basically, I've been doing this 35 plus years, and I suppose different phases of your life, you have different priorities. So I was very, very sort of practically bench orientated for probably the first 25 years of my career. And then I think beyond that, I was looking for other challenges, sort of integral to my bench work. I was training other technicians in particular techniques. I also had an opportunity at the University of Manchester, where I worked for most of the 90s, to become involved in formal teaching, sort of front of house teaching of basically modules pertaining to DNA sequencing. So these were specialist modules that I taught as an MSc, and also practical modules with theory and practice relating to DNA sequencing for MRes students at Manchester. And sort of later on, I think it's almost a question of been there, done that, got the T-shirt. I felt that I wasn't as passionate about bench work as I was earlier in my career. If I'm going to be completely honest here, with age, my eyesight has gone a little bit. So like a lot of us. So basically some of the sort of more involved sort of minutiae experiments with 384 well plates, etc., that I used to do, I think my eyesight now would struggle with one of those. And I've always been interested in teaching. And in fact, at one point in my career, I pursued a PhD at the University of Oxford, and for one reason or another, it didn't work out for me. And so I did teacher training at the University of Oxford. And this sort of reminded me of my passion for teaching, but I never went into it by virtue of anxiety issues. And let me just say as a disclaimer, I now know that I am actually characterized by autistic spectrum disorder. So I did this teacher training and it was never really used. Sort of roll the clock forward to about 8 years ago. Bench work didn't hold the passion for me that it once did. And I thought it might be a good idea to get involved with the technician commitment for that, for actually sort of providing workshops, etc. And there are other reasons for me being motivated to sort of take on that outside work, apart from the fact that it utilized my teacher training from all of those years ago.
Well, let's talk about professional registration. For our listeners who might not be familiar with it, can you explain what professional registration is?
Yes. So professional registration is basically an accreditation of your skills. And those aren't just practical skills. And by that, I mean applied skills, theory and practice at the bench or in the field, depending on the sort of work you do. It actually looks, by virtue of things called competencies that we may come back to, it looks at what you might call hard and soft skills. So it looks at you in the round. It looks at the application of theory and practice, your competency in the lab or as a field biologist or as an engineer, for example. But it also looks at things by virtue of these competencies. And there are 5 principal competencies. It looks at your planning and organization. It looks at your professional practice. And it also looks at things like your CPD and how you update that practice, etc., etc. Your work within teams, your communication skills, teaching technical specialists, as I have done and many of the audience might well do as well. But also looking at, if for the higher awards, which I'm sure we'll come on to, looking at things like communicating with non-specialist audiences. And that can include things like outreach work. And the thing about professional registration is it's basically obtained by virtue of submitting a report for these competencies that I've alluded to. So you submit this competence report. It's the mainstay of your application. Okay. That is basically offered through the Science Council in association with so-called licensed bodies, which includes things like professional organizations like the Royal Society of Chemistry and Biology, who award professional registration on behalf of the Science Council. And as a result of gaining professional registration, you actually end up with a set of post-nominals, so letters after your name that in itself can be nice and publicly accredits what you do. And there are really 3 sets of letters that sort of go back to the register that you apply for. And I'm sure Lee will expand on this, but the 3 sets of letters after your name, the post-nominals, are RSci Tech, registered science technician, RSci, registered scientist, or the highest award is chartered scientist. And with these letters, various things can open up to you.
So, yeah, I guess, following on from that, why do you think technicians should become professionally registered? What kind of impacts do you think it would have on their careers?
Well, the first reason that's often cited for becoming professionally registered is that it's a boost to confidence. Okay. You obtain your post-nominals, and the actual mechanics of applying and obtaining professional registration is no trivial feat. It's about a 5,000 word report in general. And so this can afford a boost to your confidence. And people have reported, for example, that as a result of gaining professional registration, it gives them impetus to go on and do other things. So I know of one specific example of somebody at the Sanger Centre who, by virtue of gaining CSI, was given the impetus and confidence to apply for a promotion. And in fact, she got that promotion. And indeed, the CSI post-nominals themselves contributed to gaining a promotion. But at inception, the confidence boost was afforded by becoming CSI. I suppose the second reason that's talked about a lot is that a prerequisite of applying for and obtaining your postnominals, becoming professionally registered, is joining a licensed body, usually a professional body like the Royal Society of Biology or Chemistry, if you haven't done so prior to applying for professional registration. And there are various reasons that can be a good thing. The first is the fact that these societies tend to be discipline specific, and so you network with like-minded individuals that you can learn from and collaborate with and just discuss in general things. The other reason, I suppose, is the fact that the licensed bodies actually afford opportunities that are actually quite useful CPD, and that becomes pertinent when you're thinking of renewing your registration, which you do by submitting a CPD report annually, year on year, to your chosen licensed body. So, for example, it's a well-known fact that societies like the Institute of Physics and the Royal Society of Biology will offer training courses, they'll offer opportunities to get involved at conferences. So these are things that in turn can further boost your confidence and, as I say, are actually quite useful CPD, as well as networking with individuals that might have an impact on your career. Speaking of careers, I suppose the other thing that you can talk about is the fact that whilst in most institutions there isn't an inextricable link between becoming professionally registered and facilitation of promotion, although that is obviously an aspiration of professional registration linked to the wider technician commitment. It is not uncommon, for example, when you apply for jobs, to now see that the job spec asks for professional registration or a willingness to work towards it as a desirable characteristic. So clearly, if you have that, you stand out in the crowd. And in fact, I know of managers that hire over the years who are involved in professional registration and technician initiatives who will say that actually if they get an application from somebody who is professionally registered, they look favourably upon that individual. And that's because by virtue of being professionally registered, it demonstrates a commitment to standards, to progress. Okay, it demonstrates a certain form of dynamism. So I guess those are the three main reasons that you would become professionally registered: confidence building, networking, and actually facilitation of getting to interview or maybe even getting the job. The final one I'll mention is the fact that in compiling your, if you like, working portfolio through your competency report, it's an opportunity to reflect on what you've done. So from that point of view, it's actually quite a useful CPD exercise, and people have actually reported that compiling their competency report is useful, for example, in their annual appraisals. And keep in mind that this is a report of what you have done, but also what you might want to do. And so in that sense, it's a good idea to actually involve your supervisor in what you're doing. Remember, professional registration is not time limited. It's not an assignment. You can take as long as you want to put this document together before hitting the submission button. So there you have it. I would say in the main, for most people, experience shows in the field that those are the four key benefits of professional registration.
There's lots of positives there you've mentioned. Maybe we can address some of those negatives, though. You know, sometimes when you talk to technicians about becoming professionally registered, they've got kind of concerns or maybe preconceptions of what that means. How do you kind of address those concerns?
Yeah, I mean, there are various sort of dimensions to that question. One of the concerns, and you get this particularly from older technicians, is why do it? And I would say becoming professionally registered it depends on the stage of your career that you're at. So I would say if you're older, and I actually, by virtue of my age, I came to professional registration, I think inevitably later on. And I did it simply to accredit my skills.
I guess following on from talking about accrediting skills, can we talk more about the post-nominals you talked about? And how do I decide whether I should apply for registered science technician, registered scientist, or chartered scientist?
Let me just say that when you apply for each of those registers, you fill in the same competency form with the same 5 principal competencies, obviously to a different standard and perhaps with a different level of qualification dependent on the register. Okay. So as I said earlier, those 5 competencies are tech talk, planning and organisation and adherence to standards, communication, and ethical conduct. Okay. In essence, those are the 5 principal competency categories, A to E. And your competency form and commensurate answers will depend upon your experience and qualifications, and therefore the register you elect to apply for. So if we take each of those in turn, an RSci Tech, a registered science technician, is not a novice, okay? It's someone with about 1 year's experience, so they can practice in the lab or in the field competently and independently, okay? But they wouldn't necessarily be expected to actually troubleshoot and improvise on standard operating procedures, or indeed actually be responsible for the training of others. They may, however, be responsible, in addition to their standard scientific protocols, they may also be responsible for stock taking and ordering, and actually organisation of the laboratory or facilities outside as an engineer or field biologist for others. And so I think the idea of the competency report is it looks at you in the round. It isn't just about your project work, okay, which you do discuss in competency A. It's looking at you as a whole and everything you bring to bear to practice your particular discipline with efficiency, confidently, and with competence. An RSci, or registered science technician, I always think of as being as an extension of RSci Tech. So this is somebody who has 1 to 4 or 5 years experience. And I guess the remit and what you talk about in the competencies is similar to an RSci Tech. But obviously you're expected to demonstrate by virtue of that extra experience that apart from following a prescriptive standard operating procedure accurately and independently, and knowing how to actually identify good data and know what to do with it, there's a little bit more, not surprisingly, with an RSci. That extra experience should confer the ability to actually improvise on a standard operating procedure. Okay. In addition, however, another thing that might be expected in a competency report for RSci is training. Okay. So an RSci Tech essentially is someone that's been trained and can practice independently, but they don't necessarily need to show that they're training others. Okay. A CSci is something of a different beast. I always think there's a disconnect between RSci and RSci Tech, which are extensions of one another, and CSci. So a CSci can be a team leader, although not necessarily, and I'll come on to that point in a minute. But it's someone with a little bit more experience, maybe that transgresses individual projects. So they might be responsible for leading a team. They might, in addition, be involved in a number of projects. And apart from that, they may be involved in initiatives that are more than lab-wide. They may be departmental-wide. And a CSci who is, for example, a chief technician, they may communicate with and interact with other constituent groups apart from scientists, such as estates and services, if there are structural issues within labs or in fact within departments, and in fact wider sort of departmental or university-wide, school-wide initiatives, such as introducing a different type of system, let's say for health and safety, COSH. The other thing, I guess, that separates some CSIs is the fact that for competency D in particular, they might need to demonstrate that they're scoping and planning new projects. So this isn't just improvising on a standard operating procedure which personifies RSI personnel. This may be the introduction of new procedures and associated equipment, implied health and safety, logistical concerns, etc., for setting up that equipment, training others, that for an RSI, and certainly not an RSI tech, is not expected. Let me sort of caveat that point, though, by saying one more thing before I finish talking about the three registers. People have this misconception that to be a CSI, you have to be a line manager. That is not true. First and foremostly, it's not your job title and your grade. It's about what you do in the lab on the ground, okay? Not everyone who is CSI is a bona fide team leader. Some people who are CSI work on the ground, but they don't just train, let's say, RSI techs or new PhD students. They're responsible for actually supervising them. So what do I mean by that dichotomy? If you train someone in a particular standard operating procedure and associated health and safety, so you can practice that procedure in a health and safety compliant way, good laboratory practice, but then have no more input in what happens with the data, that is synonymous with training, and that is really the realms of an RSI. A CSI, however, might be responsible, whilst they don't lead teams, they may be responsible for technical supervision of projects. So what does that mean? Okay. What that means is that they interact with the person in question to plan the experiment. They train them as an RSI would in the standard operating procedure and associated health and safety. But in addition, they have an input in terms of the data outputs. They teach those people how to identify good data. If the data is of sufficient standard, what does it mean? And what are the implications for follow-on procedures? In other words, they're more embedded in the procedural pipeline than a standalone training technique. So in essence, that I think really sums up the difference between the three registers. And if you want to know more, there are a series of seminars that the Science Council offers, including some by myself, that I've already mentioned.
So if I applied for RSI Tech, Registered Science Technician now, can I then upgrade my registration to Registered Scientist in the future?
Yes. Let me just make that point. This is something that I say in the workshops, that if you are an RSI Tech, after a year or so, you can definitely move up to RSI. And the nice thing about that is there's no fixed times that you have to be an RSI Tech or an RSI 4 before moving up. And the other thing that I always stress is the fact that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So, for example, I became an RSI, but I moved quickly from RSI to CSI. And the reason for that is I wasn't a technical manager, and I just assumed that CSI was synonymous with being a team leader. And in fact, it isn't. So there's a couple of things that I'll bring up here as part of this sort of answer. One is, sometimes technicians think that because they're technicians, they can only apply for registered science technician, that somehow registered scientist and chartered scientist are not for technicians. That's not true. It's a reflection of your skills, experiences, and responsibilities within different technical families. And that is people like research assistants, technical specialists, experimental officers, anyone with a technical based role. It isn't just somebody called a registered a technician, a traditional technician. Okay. And so there's no time limit. The other thing I wanted to bring out is the fact that you can use materials in your former report in order to, if you like, go up the scale. So I took a lot that was in my registered science competency report, that 5,000 word report. Okay. And I basically bundled it into my chartered scientist application, and then obviously filled in the bits that were missing. But let me just stress that if you're not a technical manager, and this is something I stress all of the time in workshops, it doesn't mean that you cannot apply for chartered scientist. And in fact, many people, when they look at the registers, so I would encourage people to look at the specs for the registers on the Science Council website, on the licensed body websites, on your own technician commitment websites that probably have links to those things, or even dropping me a line. And I don't know, Charlie, if you want to sort of give my email, I'm happy to do that. Many people think they're RSI when in fact they're CSI. This is a common misconception. So look at the register sort of precepts, the competency mission statements carefully, because technicians have a habit of underselling themselves. So many who are CSI actually think they're RSI. So take a look. And if you're not sure, by the way, and I'll make this comment now. One of the things I do is, if people aren't sure about which register they sit in, I will say at workshops, look, send me your CV and I'll know within 2 minutes where I think you sit. I'm fairly adept at that with experience. Okay.
Is there a stage of career that you think technicians will benefit more from professional registration? Like maybe, probably not early career, I guess, from what you've been saying, maybe more mid or late career?
Yeah, I would say for older technicians, it's more about validation, especially if you haven't had your name cited on papers. For a younger technician, based on the direction of travel, and this goes back to something I said about having technical professional registration declared as a desirable characteristic on job applications, I think it can actually facilitate your career. And I think the direction of travel is such that that's only going to increase. So I would encourage young technicians to actually become professionally registered, particularly if they are, as many technicians are even today still, on short-term contracts. It may be that within your own institutes, and you do see differences in institutes, and this is part of the challenge to standardize the landscape. You see differences in terms of the utility of professional registration within institutes and its impact on their career. And as things stand at the moment, not all institutes will gear professional registration to a viable career structure. But certainly if you're a technician on a contract, and you're therefore looking inevitably to apply for another job 1-2 years down the line, saying that you're professionally registered can help. And I can sort of personalize this a little bit, because I know of a couple of managers who have been selecting and interviewing technicians for 30 years. One, in fact, was an old lab manager of mine in Manchester that is now very much involved with the technician commitment landscape, as I am. And he was saying that sort of in the last few years, with the inception of the commitment, if he sees someone who's professionally registered, his ears will he will sort of sit up and take note, because at the very least, it shows someone that's gone to the trouble of actually carrying out this. So it shows a certain type of dynamism. And I can think of one other sort of particular scenario where, in fact, a particular job, it came down to somebody with a PhD and no professional registration, in this case, chartered scientist, and somebody with professional registration and without a PhD. And by virtue of what professional registration involves, in fact, it's not obviously the only reason, but the person with the professional registration and without a PhD was ultimately successful. And that's because, based on the plethora of skills that they talked about relating to the competencies, it was clear that this person could hit the ground running, vis-a-vis somebody with a PhD who is obviously an expert in a particular field and has demonstrable skills and knowledge in that field. But it isn't clear from the PhD per se what they're like in terms of all these other things we bring to the workplace, such as networking, troubleshooting, etc. So in fact, a corollary of that is I'm often asked, if I have a PhD, do I really need to be professionally registered? And the honest answer to that one is, if you're looking to pursue an academic career, perhaps not. But if you're looking, as many people are today with PhDs, to go down the technical managerial route, then yes, even with a PhD, I would say it's an advantage to become professionally registered as well.
It does sound like it. It's proving how well-rounded you are in technical techniques as well.
Yes.
How early in your career should you potentially be looking to do this? What skills and experience do you need to go into it? You said it's a competency thing, so you have to write down and record what you've been doing and where you meet these competencies. Is that right?
That's right, yeah. So I would say it depends on the register. And this is the beauty of professional registration, is it's designed to be inclusive. So let me throw into the mix at this point that, in fact, professional registration is about all sort of fields of STEM. So the competencies that you fill out are quite generic for that reason, okay? It isn't something geared towards a specialist subject. It's about engineers, it's about field biologists, about chemists. So those standards that you need to hit are generic, whether you're a field biologist or whether you're an immunologist in a hospital. To go back to your point, Charlie, there are registers, 3 in fact, RSci-Tech, RSci and CSci, which reflect your level of experience and to some extent qualifications, although I'll caveat that in a second. So your RSci-Tech, which is your most junior register, is someone who is level 3 as an apprentice, or someone with A levels and 1 year's experience. Okay, so that's when you go in. So if you are a sort of virgin STEM apprentice or a sort of new graduate with no experience in a professional environment, because professional registration, as I say, it's not an academic qualification. It's not about theory inculcated in a further education or an HE setting. It's about practical application. So as a minimum, you want 1 year's experience from level 3 or as a graduate, depending on your circumstances, to demonstrate that competency. And that results in RSci-Tech. RSci, I always think of as being a slightly more experienced RSci-Tech. So we can talk about the sort of dissection of the registers, but to keep on the question, it is somebody at level 5 to 6 as opposed to level 3 with 2 years experience. So what I mean by that, and we can come back to this in a second, is that you either have an HND, a higher apprenticeship, or a standard Bachelor of Science degree, plus 2 years practical experience in a professional setting. Okay. And the final register is CSci, or Chartered Scientist, where you want a minimum of 5 years experience and either an MSc or demonstration that you work at an MSc level. And this actually is quite a useful juncture to point out the concept of equivalency. So I mentioned the fact, to reiterate, that as an RSci-Tech, you either have A levels or an apprenticeship today. As an RSci, you will have an HND, a higher apprenticeship or a degree. As a CSci, you need to have an MSc. You need to show you're working at level 7. But if you lack those formal qualifications, because the whole ethos of professional registration when it was set up about 8 years ago was to be inclusive, in line with the sort of EDI times we live in. If you don't happen to have the particular mandated qualification, say a master's for a chartered scientist, or a bachelor's or higher apprenticeship for a registered scientist, RSci, then in addition to the competency report that I've touched upon, where essentially you're bringing together these illustrative scenarios fitting the competencies, almost like a working portfolio, you have the ability, in addition to submitting your orthodox competency report, this additional equivalency report. So this makes sure that it doesn't discriminate, for example, against people that may have left school and they've worked their way up the ranks. So there is this dichotomy in their case between individuals who have formal qualifications from school. They may have left with A-levels. A-levels sort of map traditionally to arts-sci tech. But by virtue of being in that environment, working their way up the career ladder, getting more involved in managerial activities, years of experience, their actual job description and responsibilities map to a CSI. So in their case, if you like, they can top up their qualifications so that they can apply for CSI by submitting this additional equivalency report.
Fab. So don't be put off if you've not got the academic qualifications there that Laurence was talking about.
No, absolutely not. No.
But apply for it anyway. Go for it anyway.
Yeah, there is definitely provision for you.
So, Laurence, you've been a strong advocate for the technician commitment. How are you involved in that initiative?
Yeah, I mean, in my case, technician commitment and professional registration, they're really inextricably linked. So what do I mean by that? Well, the technician commitment is designed to basically address the fact that the average age of the workforce, particularly in physical sciences like archaeology, physics, and engineering, is increasing because technicians are leaving and they're not being replaced in the same numbers. So the age of technicians is going up. Okay, so the technician commitment was brought about to actually try and sort of stem this attrition because it's been projected that by 2030, if it continues at the same rate without young people choosing to become a technician, there may actually be, both within the higher education sector but and also industry, a shortfall of technicians, which may have an impact on productivity in what Britain increasingly aspires to, which is a sort of technology-based economy. And the technician commitment really consists of 4 pillars. The first is visibility. So giving technicians visibility, allowing them to basically go to conferences, present, etc. All right. The second is recognition. And recognition historically, I think, was things like names on papers. But increasingly now, because that is happening actually less than when I was at university and having graduated and come into it in the late 80s and 90s, recognition is really considered synonymous with professional registration. And the final 2 career pillars are really about training and retaining technicians. And so in many ways, they're the most ambitious and in some ways the most sort of the most significant of those 4 pillars. And I came into the technician commitment because I became professionally registered in 2017. And as I say, as an older technician, it was simply to validate my skills. But then when I started to look at the broader remit of the technician commitment outside of professional registration per se, I thought to myself, do you know what? This is something that I think I'd like to become involved in, become an advocate for, because I think in many ways conditions for technicians since the early 2000s have got worse than when I started. There are additional opportunities now that we can talk about. But in many ways, things like names on papers, funding to go to conferences, those things now are being cut back on, and not just sort of for fiscal reasons. It's a change in emphasis on what technicians do. So I thought, well, if the technician commitment is designed to basically try and redress the balance, or rather imbalance, and effectively in some ways turn the clock back to how it was in the 90s, albeit in a contemporary context, that's something I'd like to support, because I think many technicians today don't have the training opportunities to go to conferences. They're not getting their names on papers in a way that I did. And I always give a little anecdote when I talk about this, and that's the fact that early in my career in 1995, I went for a job interview. I was at Manchester at the time. I spent most of my career at that stage in Manchester, okay? And I went for an interview at the Christie Hospital, which is a famous cancer research hospital in Manchester. And one of the things that was stressed to me quite explicitly in the interview was they said to me, it is policy, institutional policy, not to put the names of technicians on papers. Now, I think one of the reasons, interestingly, that they said that is because back then it was actually quite common for technicians to be put on papers. And they were saying, look, we want to make this clear that if you come here, you won't do this. I think today they wouldn't even say that. It would be a moot point because so many technicians are excluded from papers. So the technician commitment, apart from professional registration, is involving things like Royal Societies and also the paymasters, the funding bodies, who are starting to say, having sort of joined up to the technician commitment themselves, look, if we give you money, we expect you to include all people, all groups of people that have contributed to the sort of research milestones that we are funding. We want them acknowledged on papers. We want you to send them to conferences. You know, we're giving you this money and we're telling you this is what we want to happen. So I just think it's a very laudable aim, given that technicians are.
I think that's right. I think we should point out at this juncture, though, that within the University of Edinburgh, we've got a very clear policy about including technicians on papers. So if anybody out there is listening and is worried about that side, and you can always get in touch with the Technician Steering Committee if you've got any worries and want to talk about that. There's also quite a bit of funding now coming along from places like the ITSS and TSN to allow technicians to go on conferences. So I think there is a lot of opportunities starting to develop out there. So I think that's maybe we've got to the bottom and are kind of heading in the right direction again.
No, I would actually totally agree with that, Lee. I think maybe we've seen the lowest point, and by virtue of the technician commitment and other independent initiatives with the same aims, having recognised the fact that this was becoming a trend, I think, yes, I would agree with you. I think the trend now is starting to be reversed, and there are certain trailblazing institutes that, if you like, are leaders of the pack. And the nice thing is that they create models which other institutes that perhaps lag behind in that sense, and I know Edinburgh is one of the leaders, they can emulate that practice.
It sounds like professional registration ticks quite a lot of the technician commitments boxes. It covers all the pillars.
Yeah, I mean, I would say to that, Charlie, they're not mutually exclusive. I mean, professional registration, and I'm a sort of an example of this, by becoming professionally registered, by getting those post-nominals, by sort of, as a result of that, integrating in through the Royal Societies, then becoming involved with the Science Council. It has created other opportunities for me, and not just me, for other people as well, that, if you like, tick the visibility, the pillar one of the technician commitment, because I present at conferences. And to some extent, it's given me a viable career outside. So that, as you say, quite rightly say, Charlie, that feeds in to those other pillars of the technician commitment 3 and 4. So yes, they're definitely not mutually exclusive.
If people listening are thinking, this sounds cool, I could, this sounds like it might be for us, where should they start? What's the first step?
If you basically contact the Science Council, or you contact licensed bodies, and just look at their websites as well, there's an awful lot on there, such as the Royal Society of Chemistry, the Royal Society of Biology, and they're just two of a number of licensed bodies. I think there's 28 currently that fall under the aegis of the Science Council, and that reflects the fact that it's meant to cover different fields, science, engineering, etc.
You would pick that licensed bodies. You'd pick one that's kind of suited what your role was. Is that how it works?
Yeah, and I would say as well, and this is something that Lee has sort of touched upon, that many universities are now, I think it's something like half of universities are signatories to the technician commitment. So, of course, in-house within your institute, you have probably got a website. And I know Edinburgh University has a very good website where you can find out things about professional registration and the technician commitment, and why you should become professionally registered. And the other thing I'd say is that with this plethora of material online, there are even things like training videos that talk about why you should become professionally registered. And I offer workshops on behalf of the Science Council, but also the RSB, the NTDC, etc. And some of these workshops are available online. And if you're prepared to sit through them, and I know that's a big ask, listening to me for an hour, it will obviously give you reasons to why you should consider professional registration. There's a lot of learning materials as well that people like me have developed and are online, linked to things like the NTD website. The Science Council has a YouTube site, and there are lots of videos that have been made by me as an applicant support mentor for the Science Council and my two other colleagues that occupy that role, that talk about how you become professionally registered, why you should become professionally registered, etc., etc.
That's great. We should get those links, and we'll put those in the description of this podcast. And maybe a chance to put Charli on the spot and talk about costs. And you can remind me, what is the university scheme for covering costs? Do you remember?
I do know that, yes. So the costs of the first year are funded, and that funding comes from the College of Science and Engineering, College of Medicine and Veterinary Medicine, and the College of Arts and Humanities and Social Sciences. The fund itself is administered by the Talent and Development team, and all the details are on our website. So if you are interested in thinking about applying, please contact Talent and Development team to just make sure everything's in place for funding before you apply. The university also does cover 50% of the annual renewal costs after your initial registration, so there is continuous support in place for you to carry on with being professionally registered.
So there's an initial cost of applying through your licensed body in association with the Science Council, which hopefully will culminate in your post-nominals. And then annually, you need to demonstrate that you're still basically hitting those benchmarks, not through basically a de novo updated competency report. You're not expected to basically write a sort of 5,000 word report. You normally put in something like a 7-page application, a CPD application, and that goes to the licensed body. And in that case, the cost involved in retaining your post-nominals, your RSci-Tech, RSci or CSci, is the cost of renewing with your licensed body, which in that instance is just a membership fee for that year. And institutes will usually, as a minimum, if they're a signatory to the commitment, a lot will either be or will basically say they are going to fund at least that initial application. And then I suppose depending on the sort of finances and structures within the institutes, they often say, as Edinburgh has, that they'll underwrite subsequent costs of annual renewal, or at least a portion thereof.
How long would you say if I was going to go do this now, how long should I expect it to take?
Let me sort of break that down into two parts, if I may, which is actually applying. So the first thing that I always say in workshops, and this is something maybe I haven't stressed enough, that one way of finding out about professional registration is the Science Council holds monthly workshops that are given by me and two of my colleagues. And you could literally just go along to one of those and just listen, and it covers it all apart from the stuff online. And as I say, if you haven't got time within your schedule to do that, there are recordings, particularly of me giving these workshops through various organizations. But let me just say, in terms of applying, it's not an assignment. Okay. So what I would say to people is write down your different skills. Okay. Think outside the box and then put this together as a rough draft. And then having basically obtained a rough draft, submit it. But I would get it looked at in the meantime, either in-house or even I often will proofread applications, okay, and tell people whether they hit muster or not, okay. So there is sort of informal support from people like me as an external applicant support mentor. There are equivalent people within, let's say, the Royal Society of Chemistry. And then usually, if you've got a sort of a steering committee, you're a signatory to the commitment, it could be that there's sort of skills in-house. Okay, so take your time building up your materials, putting together your portfolio, get it checked in-house or externally by people like me, and then submit. And then the second half of your question, if I understand it, Charlie, was actually how long then will it take to be awarded your post-nominals? Well, the way that the appraisal works is having submitted to your sort of competency report. And by the way, this can be done through the Science Council Common Application Portal, their online portal. But you can do it independently through actually the licensed bodies. And sometimes there are restrictions. So, for instance, if you want to apply as a chartered scientist, as a chemist through the Royal Society of Chemistry, that can only be done through the Royal Society of Chemistry specific portals. But most people, for one reason or another, they choose the online Common Application Portal of the Science Council, or CAP. Okay. And what will happen is that having submitted your hopefully vetted and polished application, okay, it will then go out. The Science Council will send it to the licensed body if you haven't put in the application through the licensed body itself. And it will go out to 2 independent assessors. And I should point out that in addition to providing workshops as an applicant support mentor, I'm also, until recently, I was an assessor. That will go out to 2 assessors, and they are expected to look at it usually within about a month. There are time frames that the individual licensed bodies will set, but usually it's 2 to 4 weeks. And after that time, they submit a report. If they agree on everything, then essentially the Science Council is informed that the person has met the standards and they're actually awarded their post-nominals. So best case scenario is that can take from submitting maybe 2 months. But there are there are idiosyncrasies in the sense that if you would, for instance, submit through the Royal Society of Biology, or you go through CAP and you nominate the Royal Society of Biology as a licensed body, they will vet their applications quarterly. So it's a little bit longer if you just do a quarterly deadline. But yeah, all things being equal, it's about 2 months to 5 months, the latter being if it's quarterly applications.
I think it's worth pointing out that it's a very supportive kind of process. I feel that it's not like somebody comes to you and say, "Oh, you failed." It's more like, well, you've done really well, but you're not quite hitting these couple of points. If you had a bit more evidence, that would get you there. Or, for example, say you've applied for CSI, they might come back and say, "Well, you haven't quite got there." So either you can get this extra evidence in place, or you can go for RSI. So then you kind of get that choice. Do you really want to put that extra effort in, or you're happy with RSI? So I think it's it's very supportive. And I think the other thing I would say, Laurence, which I think most technicians when they're applying struggle with, I know I did, is to use the word I a lot rather than we.
Yes.
Technicians tend to do things in teams and don't like to take credit for everybody, but you're really looking to say, what have you done on that project? So use I did, even if it's part of the team, but you're trying to pull out what you contributed. And that's kind of advice I give people when I read theirs. And I think Laurence is completely right. You want somebody independent to yourself to read it. Hopefully somebody who knows your kind of work anyway, because then when you're being all shy and about how great you are, you've got somebody there looking over your shoulder saying, well, you need to mention this, this, and this, because these are really great points, and you've done all these fantastic things, so just say it, and that can really help.
It's so hard, isn't it, to do that for yourself. You really have someone else there to help you pull out that contributions that you've made. I definitely would struggle with that.
And there's a lot of people now in Edinburgh who have got professional registration. I think we've got all this somewhere. So, there's a group of people you can reach out to kind of ask to look through your submission before you're ready to go, or maybe if you're just looking for some advice on those.
There's a list on the SharePoint, on our technician SharePoint, of a few people who have indicated they are willing to help talk to people interested in.
So Laurence, that's been a fantastic kind of overview of the professional registration process. Maybe in the future, if we get lots of comments on this podcast, we can get you back and we can ask people for questions, like specific questions on their application process. and maybe some really good pointers on applying. Would you be up for coming back in the future? And
I certainly would. I mean, the one thing actually that you and Charlie know, but might not be publicly known, is I have a special affection for Edinburgh because I spent 7 years at the University of Edinburgh. And in fact, it was, without wishing to be divisive and name names, it was one of my sort of golden periods. And in fact, this is one of the reasons, because I've moved around over 35 years and I've seen differences in how technicians are supported. Having become professionally registered myself, I was motivated, therefore, to become part of the sort of technician commitment bandwagon to try and promote that best practice that you see in places like Edinburgh. And as I say, I talk from personal experience here where Edinburgh is concerned.
I just want to say we've talked a lot about STEM and professional registration in STEM. Obviously, Laurence, you work for the Science Council. There is now a creative registration framework for professional registration within the Creative Technologists Network.
Yeah, let me just expand on that briefly. So if you look at the competencies as formulated by the Science Council, and I think the Science Council is a very tendentious term, it sort of gives it away, doesn't it? You know, it is very much geared towards people who are STEM, as you would expect with a mothership called the Science Council. And I used to get traditionally, let's say about 3 or 4 years ago, because I've been giving these workshops since 2018 for the IST and subsequently the Science Council, RSB and NTDC. And you would get people turn up who are creative technicians, they're audiovisual. And I did feel in many ways they were disenfranchised because the competencies were written in such a way that it presupposed some sort of STEM-based activity. So I felt in a way that wasn't intentional that they were disenfranchised and discriminated against. And the nice thing is that this was recognized by movers and shakers in other institutes, particularly the Institute of Science and Technology, the IST. And so, in fact, now the IST, in association with arts-based organizations, has come up with a creative professional registration certification, which is really missing. And I am really, really glad that now exists. It's existed. It came about this year. So if you are, let me just say that if you are a creative technician as opposed to someone who is orthodox in STEM, look at the Institute of Science and Technology, the IST website, and all the information you need there to become a creative practitioner is available. And they have their own. They formulated, not surprisingly, their own sort of analogous competency categories, but very much geared towards the sort of experiences that you would have and promote within the creative industries, as opposed to traditional science and engineering.
That's fantastic. And we'll put links to everything we've talked about in the show notes. So hopefully it will be quite easy to find.
Well, thank you very much, Laurence. That's been a great chat. Thanks for coming in.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, you're most welcome. I've enjoyed it.
Bye. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening. We hope you found this information useful and it's answered all those questions that you had about professional registration. If you would like more information, please do check out all the links we've included or reach out to us at technician.network@ed.ac.uk. If you do apply for professional registration, please let us know so we can support you through the process. See you next time. Recognition and visibility are two of the key areas of the Technician Commitment, an initiative led by the UK Institute for Technical Skills and Strategy. It's so important to us that we make sure that technicians behind the research get the recognition and visibility that they deserve. And we hope this podcast is one small step towards that goal. Technically Edinburgh is hosted and edited and produced by members of the University of Edinburgh Technician Steering Committee. Please follow us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to tell your friends and colleagues. Have us on obnoxiously loud in your lab so everyone can hear. Oh, and if you have any ideas for topics, would like to come along and chat with us, or even think you might like to have a go at hosting, please get in touch at technician.network@ed.ac.uk. Thanks again to our amazing guest, our brilliant co-hosts, and you for listening. See you next time.